delighted to be here to kick off the presentations today. This is a subject close to my heart. I actually started my career up here in Aberdeen working for Mobil North Sea as a production geologist. So although I've been in McKinsey for a while now, it's good to be back on a subject that I enjoy a lot. So what we're going to do today with you is to share two things, I think, to try and get this conference today underway. First is share some of the trends that we see around the sector, overall trends from our most recent operator survey that we do across the North Sea, and then secondly offer some thoughts, some implications around what that might mean for the business and for the opportunities and future of the sector here. So let me kick off straight away. It's hard to ignore the kind of backdrop here. I know we're at $50 and we have been for this beginning of the year, more or less. Bit of optimism starting to thankfully finally creep back into the sector, but it's hard to ignore that there's been a third of the cost has been taken out globally of the sector since the peak in 2014. You can see here on the chart we have on the left hand side you have global capex. This is a global picture, all operators, and we can find the data for over 100 operators. On the right hand side it's OPEX. A similar picture down around a third, an encouraging tick up back in capex there you see in the last quarter that we have data for end of last year, so maybe a sign of things turning slightly, but spend levels now are the same as they were globally last 7 years ago, with at least 100 billion taken out of the industry, something everybody in this room will know well. If we now zoom into the real heart of the discussion today, so North Sea and well intervention spend, well maintenance spend, and this data is based off our survey. So this is based off 50 major assets across the North Sea, UK, Norway, Danish sector as well, and you can see what's happening to the spend in our sector. So we've gone from 1.3 billion spend for these assets on expense maintenance for wells in 2014, and we're down 43%. So that's a greater decrease than the overall reduction in the industry spend. So as a result, you can sort of see on the right hand side that we're actually spending less now on well maintenance than we have been previously. Now that raises a question: is this because the opportunities have disappeared? There are no further opportunities for us to go after here in the North Sea? And I think the answer personally is that, as we see it, absolutely not. And I think hopefully that's the same reason we're all here today. And to get an indication of what the opportunity might still be, at least from where we see it, is to look at another metric that we collect and measure as part of our work, and that is the number of shut-in wells. So if you bear with me for a second, I'll explain what we're showing here. So what we've got here is it's a bigger group now, so we've got close to 100 fields across the North Sea. We've got of the total wells drilled in those fields, how many are currently shut in, and then across the axis on the bottom we've tried to indicate the maturity of the field, and to do that we've just used water cut. You can use age or reserve depletion, it's the same story, but we use water cut here. So as you can see, a couple of things is there's quite a range. The second thing is that there are more shut-in wells as the fields have more depleted, more water cut. That's, I think, pretty obvious, nothing surprising there. But then the third thing is on average 1 in 5 wells that are drilled are currently shut in across the North Sea. Some of these will be permanently shut in and not coming back. But if you just do a small, without taking too many liberties with the assumptions, if you assume that you can get some of the fields with the wells, high degrees of well shut in above the line, you can go back in and restore some of those wells down to an average level, and you're able to get the production back of levels that are similar to some of the production on-stream wells that are in those same fields. Then you can very quickly get some big production numbers. And here we've just done a quick back of the envelope calculation on the data set here, and we very quickly get up to a couple 100,000 barrels a day of production. Now that in itself would be a major development here in the North Sea, which would attract billions of dollars of investment, tax breaks, etc., etc. So the prize itself is enormous. And there's some good news in the data that we see as well. If we zoom into another metric that we look at, which is production losses, and this is measured by the amount of capacity that operators believes in their assets compared to the actual production. The gap between that attracts as production losses. And we zoom into two specific categories of those production losses, and those particularly around the reservoir and wells. So the first one we'll explain is reservoir losses. So this is the lighter grey boxes you see on the top half of these charts. The left-hand chart is a percentage of the total potential. The right-hand side is a share between the two. The reservoir losses on the top, these are losses due to the well not producing as expected. It could be because of mechanical impairment in the well, sand infill, lack of gas lift, lack of pressure support. Those are the lighter grey box. And then the blue box underneath is the losses incurred to actually doing the well work itself. So either testing or intervening in the well. And you'll see a couple of things interesting about this trend, which I think are positive. One is that from 2008 up to a peak in 2012, the actual amount of losses that were incurred here in the North Sea increased year on year on year. They peaked in 2012. That's actually a big part of that was the Elgin-Franklin losses, well losses in Elgin-Franklin. But since then, actually, every year we're incurring fewer and fewer losses or reporting fewer and fewer losses. That's one thing. The second thing, though, which I think is more interesting for us, is that the share of the work done, the losses incurred, have moved away from the first part of the 2008, 9, and so on. The majority of losses were because of the wells and the reservoir not performing. Now, as we move to later, and particularly 2015, the majority of the losses are actually us going after those problems. So we switched from incurring losses waiting to get in to intervene and fix things to incurring losses actually fixing things. So the shift has moved over. It's one sort of encouraging sign. The second encouraging sign is that we know what good looks like for operators. Based on the research that's been done, the surveys that have been done in the past, we know very clearly what good now looks like around well interventions, well work, reservoir management. And just to illustrate that, we've picked two real operators, similar portfolios, mix of offshore wells, mostly platform but some subsea wells, similar blend. And you can see that operator A, which would be towards the lower end of the ranking, delivers around 2% of incremental production from their well intervention activity. Whereas operator B is up much closer to double figures, so 9, 10+% across their portfolio. And when you look at it, there are two main drivers for this. The first one is intervention intensity. So how many wells do you intervene in on average over the year? And we can see here that the first one is about 1 in 15, whereas operator 2 is closer to 1 in 3. So intervention intensity is one big driver, so getting in and getting after the opportunities. The second one, which is perhaps a bit less intuitive, but very interesting, is we've shown that consistently the operators with higher amounts of intervention performance and production use a broader range of intervention tools. So they don't just have one tool, they have a broader toolkit. So sand fills, reperforations, water shut-off, gas shut-off, and so on. They're actually a broader range of tools applied, and they're more intensive. And those two things come together, drive better overall performance. And that range between kind of the operator A's of this world and the operator B actually comes through in all of the main areas that we see around kind of performance, around well intervention and reservoir management. And on the next page, we've given some examples. We've taken an average operator, hypothetical operator, 100,000 barrels a day, and we've looked at taking them and we've put them an average performance on all of the main dimensions that we look at. And we said, how much value would there be from getting from average to top quartile on each of these metrics? And you can see here we've grouped those around well interventions, the focus of today. You can see at the top the additional recovery moving from that 2, 3 to 9, 10%. We've looked at getting some of the shut-in wells restored. incremental production from that. We've also looked at the other areas, water injection, so getting injection wells up, injection capacity, reliability up, water in. And then finally, we've also looked at just the intensity that the infills, the drilling, the way the operators have chased the reserves in their fields. And you can see there's a big difference in all of these different dimensions between the average operators and the good, and you put it all together, and it creates an opportunity that is easily, even at $50, and this is run at $50, easily 100 million value generated in a year. So a huge opportunity across to get after. So of course, the question, I guess then is, well, how do you do this? How do you get after this? And what needs to be in place? And we're lucky enough to work across operators in the work that we do, see different ways of dealing with this around the North Sea and around the world. And we've pulled that together, and we see typically there are the differences between the good and the average and the not very good can be grouped into three areas. And we've sort of drawn them up here. So first, there are differences in what we're calling the technical system. This is the processes, the tools, the approaches that operators take, the process side of things. The second one is the organization, so capability, capacity of the organization, how it's configured, how responsibilities are organized. And then the final one is around the philosophy, the attitudes around the industry, around the activity. So very clearly some of the differentiating things we see are making sure there's a process in place that identifies the opportunity and gets them through to execution. Sounds very obvious, but is often the thing that's most missing. There's rigorous performance tracking for the opportunities, and that there's a good way of transferring knowledge between the jobs that go very well and the jobs that fail between different assets. So that's sort of the heart of a good system, a technical system. An example, which we show here, the steps will be familiar with people here in the room. We have, first of all, performance around kind of data acquisition. So how are you set up to make sure that you have the right data, the test, the surveillance set up. The second one is the system around opportunity identification, filling up the hopper and progressing it through. Moving on to the planning of the execution, after you've got the approvals and the budgeting, then the execution itself, and finally the performance monitoring. So having all those steps in place, again, sounds very straightforward, but the real challenge is in making this happen. You can see here that we've also put down some success measures that we see good operators following. So, are they actively looking at the surveillance, which meters are up and working, what the surveillance plan is, the execution against the surveillance plan. We're looking at the health and breadth and depth of the opportunities in the opportunity funnel, and so forth. So making sure that you have good performance management throughout that. And we've got some examples here where you can actually go in with good practice that we've seen. It's not an exhaustive list, but it allows you to compare against what the best do to get the most value for the investment spend around interventions. The second area that we talked about was organization capabilities. I think this, the system, everybody has a system at least on paper. The thing that makes it come to life that we see is really having the organization lined up around this. And there are a number of things here that matter. First one is making sure there's clear responsibility for the well work and reservoir management in the group. It's a multidisciplinary, cross-discipline effort, which we'll hear about in some of the later presentations in more detail. So making sure that it's clear who does what through the process and it goes end to end. The second one is that there's a set of KPIs and targets around it. And finally, that they have the right resources, cash, capacity, capability to make this work. And that's something that potentially has been missing in the last few years here, particularly in the North Sea. Yeah, a typical example of a organisation as you might find in any of the operators here in Aberdeen, Stavanger, around the world. You have the reservoir subsurface team, production engineering. You've got the operations team, and you've got the well engineering team. And you can see those that people configure them in different ways, but we all have those three disciplines. And through that, you can see here in blue all the individuals that are involved in some part of the process. And whichever way you cut it and slice it and dice it, you're always going to have a end-to-end, cross-disciplinary approach to doing this well. And you can see some of the processes that we've highlighted. Surveillance, where does that sit? How does that link between the subsurface, the operations? These cut through. So a key part of getting this right is to make sure that you navigate this piece of the puzzle very well. The final area that we talked about is a bit about the philosophy you have, the attitude you have, mindsets and behaviors around well intervention, well work. The three things that we see here are important. We work a lot with operators trying to understand the full potential of their assets, their business, in terms of being able to generate value and cash. And obviously people look at cost reductions, people look at production and reliability. But in at least all the ones I've worked in, the biggest lever in terms of value is around incremental production from well interventions, infill drilling. It generates more cash, it's usually better economics, it usually delivers quicker. Yet it's often not the first area people look. So I think one of the mindsets that we see for really good operators is that they understand this is a core part of driving value for the business. In fact, as important, if not more, than some of the other two main levers that we see applied here across the industry. So making sure that well integrity, optimization are considered at the top level as a value driver. That's number one. The number two is that we know some well interventions unfortunately fail, but we also know that some interventions are extremely successful. And actually, statistically, you're more likely to succeed than fail. Technical execution success rates are well over 50% for most jobs. But people always remember the one that failed, and that casts a much longer shadow than the three that succeeded. So the ability for asset teams, and we also showed earlier that the asset teams that are able, or the operators that are able to use a broader suite of intervention types, end up delivering more production. So finding a way to help assets, help operators broaden out and be more comfortable trying a range of different things that they may personally not be so comfortable with. And I guess that's a lot of the discussion we'll have with some of the providers, technology providers today. How do we do that? But that's crucial. And the final thing, of course, is making sure that you know how you're performing against historical and an ability to want to learn from data. How do we perform against ourselves previously? How do we perform against our assets? How do we perform against others? Of course, there are a number of different operators, ways to do that. Wean is a great example here in the North Sea of benchmarking ability. Of course, we provide the same sort of service outside. So that's a little bit the theory. I want to leave you with a real example to kind of bring it together now. So this is a real example that we were working with. Here is a business, assets, and it's a pretty bleak situation. This is an asset where production had been falling year on year, and over the period we've shown, which is about 6 months, you can see that production really started, the decline really started to accelerate. And the acceleration was actually caused by something of a downward spiral of two factors. One, plant reliability, poor plant reliability, and the second one was poor execution of interventions. And the reason these were connected was that the poor reliability made the impact of the interventions, the economics bad. The lack of intervention execution created problems with fluid through the plant, which caused reliability issues. So a real downward spiral that was sort of starting to accelerate off. And you can see from the chart or eyeball that about half of the production was lost in a very short period. So at this point, the asset intervened, the operator intervened to try and turn this around. And they did so very successfully. So restored, at least in a very short period, got the production back up, and then went on, and this is a recent example, so recently now, I think in the last few months, had recorded record production from this asset. So you can really see that the production stepping up. 60% impact in production, 59, and they were able to do that in a number of ways by really making sure that the well intervention activity was maximum value. So much sharper prioritization of the work, much better execution, and at the same time dealing with some of the reliability issues that were causing the problem. It's often the case that reliability issues and well interventions end up coming together as part of the solution. They did this in a number of ways. Interestingly, and back to the cross-discipline area, pulled together weekly meetings of a cross-discipline team to unblock issues that were causing a problem, whether they be logistics, operations, supply chain, materials management. The second thing was actually really try and work on some lean principles like you have in manufacturing around the well intervention process, using tools like Gemba walks and so on to understand where the bottlenecks were in the execution. Building actually on capability, so creating a temporary training center dedicated to building up the skills on some of these core areas as part of this turnaround effort. And I think this kind of combination is best described as sort of a machine or an engine, and we've laid it out here on this cartoon here. And what we see here, and I think this is probably a good message for today overall, is we see in the middle you have well interventions, the big cog that was driving the turnaround in this particular asset. And you can see that while it's the center to get it moving well, first of all, that well intervention drove up the recovery of the asset and led them to deliver record production in recent months. It also was a fantastic catalyst to get some of the other things working. So to really get it humming, you need all the other cogs turning, and some of them needed to be replaced, some need to be oiled, get things moving again. So you can see here that well intervention to work well, they needed to work on the cross-team, the cross-discipline working. You can see here they also needed a much better relationship with the contractor, the supplier, much better understanding around what was going wrong, problem solving. You see that it had a hugely beneficial effect at the heart of the business, getting this to work well. So of course it delivered production, but it also built up the well intervention itself was able to drive improvements throughout the whole business, the whole operator itself, right the way through maintenance to materials planning. So I think let me draw the presentation here at least to a close and open for questions. How do we as Energy Insights get involved in this? I think very briefly we do have a benchmark which allows us to support operators and suppliers in a number of ways. I think the first one is just to help understand where the performance is relative to the external areas around value, around activity levels, and then operational activity NPT. Where are the opportunities? Where does good look like? And then the second one is we try to link the practices together. But let me leave it here. Pause. That concludes the presentation. Be delighted to answer any questions or start a discussion with any of you right now, and we can pick it up later as well.